This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org.
This is Walter Koenig, Chekhov from Star Trek, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. All this may mean something.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. Well, we haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome everyone to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture and how Star Trek relates to it. I'm Duncan Barrett and with me as ever is Tony Black.
Hello Duncan, how are you this fine evening?
I'm not bad, how are you?
Good. I'm very excited to be talking the Trek we're talking today because I think we've hit up on a really interesting topic for this one, which covers sort of a little bit of the kind of things we've been talking about in previous episodes. But I think I'm quite excited to get more into the real world, elements behind some of the Star Trek greats. So this is going to be a good one, I think.
No pressure then. Well, I agree. I mean, we're not just looking at kind of literary inspiration. We're not just looking at historical inspiration in terms of the history that people have read. What we're going to be looking at today is kind of history as it's lived through by some of the key people. So just to clue the listeners into what on earth we're going on about, basically this episode is going to be about the Second World War in the original series. And you might think that's a strange topic. You might sort of think Second World War, Star Trek, the obvious place to go would be Deep Space Nine, maybe Voyager. There's quite a lot of Voyager episodes that kind of touched on the Second World War. But really what we're looking at is more the people themselves. The original series, of course, happened only, 20 odd years after the end of the Second World War. And for a lot of the people working on that show, both the cast and on the crew, the creative side, had actually served in the Second World War and brought those experiences with them. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of those people and the wartime experiences that they had. So I think probably the best place to start really is with Mr. Star Trek himself, Gene Roddenberry. Do you want to talk to us a bit, Tony, about Gene's war service and what happened there? You
might think that Gene Roddenberry would have been a soldier in the sense of certain of the other cast, but he was actually more of a pilot. And he was during the war. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant, and he obtained a pilot's license through the United States Army Air Corps, the civilian pilot training program, and he enlisted with the USAAC in 1941, around the time of Pearl Harbor. Actually, it was December 1941, so it would have been around the time that the Americans were starting to enter the war. So it was quite a key moment, really, when he came into it. And then he was commissioned in August of the following year. And there's an interesting factor about Roddenberry's service that I think possibly, informs a lot of the kind of stories he would tell or the kind of path he took to getting towards Star Trek, because there was quite a tragic accident that he was involved in when he was a pilot. He was posted to Bellows Field in Oahu, and he joined the 394th Bomb Squadron, 5th Bombardment Group. It was August 1943, about a year after he got his second lieutenant commission, and he was flying with several other men, and he was trying to fly out of Espiritu Santo, but he overshot the runway when he was piloting, impacted trees, crushed the nose, started a fire, and 2 men died. There was an official report, obviously, and Roddenberry was cleared of any responsibility, but even though he spent the remainder of his military career in the States, he then became a plane crash investigator. Later on, he was involved in a further plane crash, but he was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. But he obviously was involved, that's one of the things I think that probably marked his service during the war, being involved in this accident where he may well have, experienced an element of real sort of survivor's guilt, or guilt at having, felt responsible for the deaths of these men. And I do, as I was finding out about this, I was wondering, did an experience like that and his subsequent, he obviously piloting, flying, there are obviously correlations to the idea of it, discovering new places, flying off to different, in Star Trek's case, worlds. Was he marked by this, and did it sort of inform in his writing some of the tales or some of the stories he wanted to tell, really, as he grew older?
I think it must have informed. I mean, I'm thinking both Captains Kirk and Picard go through quite grueling court-martial experiences, don't they? Having lost in Picard's case, having lost his ship, in Kirk's case, having lost a member of his crew. And, for Roddenberry, I mean, he was completely exonerated by the investigation. They said that basically he'd done everything he should have done. But some of his comrades felt differently. He was already, in some ways, although he was a very charismatic guy and particularly with the ladies, very, gregarious and charming man, he was also in some ways a bit of a loner with the other crew and the other pilots and so on. They felt he was a bit of an intellectual. He was given to quoting Shakespeare at them. He didn't always endear himself to them. And I think after this accident in which 2 people were killed, it seems like they definitely, some of them, they blamed him and they slightly shunned him for it. And really that was kind of right at the end of his real military career out in the field. And it was after that he sort of got sent back to America quite soon after and moved into this slightly different role, investigating plane crashes. He seems to have been a man who survived quite a few plane crashes. I mean, he was involved in that one that you mentioned on the runway. My understanding, by the way, was that they hadn't actually taken off. It was a launch that failed and that they overshot the runway rather than it being something that happened in the air. But there was that one. There was obviously the famous one that we know about in his civilian career on the Pan Am flight, which has been popularised recently by that online cartoon, the Oatmeal cartoon. Incredible story, really. This was in 1947, and he was on a plane that went down, and many people died, but he and other members of the crew survived in the desert for some time and eventually got through it. It does strike me, in Star Trek, I've always thought it's surprising how many shuttlecraft accidents end with, the shuttle basically kind of totaled, but everyone is, broadly speaking, in one piece. And, I've always sort of thought, is that really plausible that a spaceship comes down to land on a planet and that's a kind of survivable incident? But maybe that owes something to Roddenberry's experience of getting through these plane crashes in one piece.
Well, yeah, possibly. And it could be, for like you say, further involved in his psychology of everything going forward. He did fly a lot of missions, though. He flew 89 combat missions during the war in the Army Air Forces. So a lot of that could have inspired his interest in some of the more galactic sort of adventure. Space battles in the 60s show wasn't quite as they ended up becoming later on in Star Trek. But there were episodes where it was two opposing forces, like Balance of Terror, say, in the 60s show, where you've got a enemy commander and a ship, and you've got that kind of submarine battle in space, I suppose, in some respects. So there could have been that dogfight element, and that factor towards what Roddenberry was doing in the war, which again could have inspired certain elements of Star Trek, even though Star Trek wasn't the show akin to something like Star Wars that was all much more about space battles and that kind of thing. That obviously isn't the heart of Star Trek. But it could have been a factor. Yeah,
and I guess, one of the things that struck me reading a bit about Roddenberry's military career and the planes that he flew, he was flying these B-17 bombers, which were, I think, a kind of, a bit like, we know about the Flying Fortress bombers, the same kind of principle. So there would be quite a large crew, it'd be quite a large plane compared to, maybe when we think about, say, the Battle of Britain or something, quite small fighter planes or whatever. These were big bombers with a decent number of people on board. And they were also, apparently, the B-17 was a very tough aircraft, basically. It could take quite a punishing without going down. So, in some ways, that sort of reminds me of the kind of situations that you see in Star Trek. I sort of think when you think about kind of aerial fighting in the Second World War, you kind of think of a plane that it's about, if you hit it, then that's it. It drops from the sky. Whereas these things were kind of designed to take a bit of a bashing and hopefully keep on flying and get you back home again. And they did have some scary encounters in there. There was one mission that Roddenberry flew, and they they saw a Japanese kind of spotter plane basically kind of tailing them and reporting where they were, and then suddenly they were intercepted by these Japanese fighters. And these bombers, they'd go on their sorties. They had no fighter escort of their own, so they didn't really have, I mean, they had some guns, but they weren't very well equipped to defend themselves. And interestingly, the course of action they took to get away from these fighters was that Roddenberry apparently flew the plane into a bank of clouds, which is very much kind of what you would think of as a sort of Star Trek solution to, I mean, we were talking last week about the Wrath of Khan and the Mutara Nebula and whether that sort of ties into ideas about submarine warfare or ancient ship battles where you've got clouds and fog and all these sort of things. But here it is sort of almost another way of looking at those kind of battles, a situation where you're trying to get out of the clear of empty space and into somewhere where it's a bit murky and you can't necessarily be spotted. So they had that quite terrifying experience and survived it. And other missions as well that extraordinarily they survived. They flew through a typhoon at one point and were hurled around in the inside of this plane and just about managed to get through the other side and get the plane home again. So certainly I guess Roddenberry was someone who he wasn't just in the forces and he sat behind a desk or whatever. He was doing pretty dangerous, pretty serious kind of frontline action, and in this quite kind of heroic mould as well. I mean, the pilots, there's a real charm and a real charisma. There's something of the kind of Captain Kirk about that. I think, risk is our business. That's kind of what they were doing. And for Roddenberry, I think there was a sexual dimension to that as well, insofar as, he would make the most. He didn't hang out with the other guys in his crew very much. He would make the most of, going around and chatting up the women that he could find and sort of playing the pilot card, I'm the heroic pilot, and kind of charming them that way. He was actually married at the time, but apparently a lot of the men that he served with, when they found this out, they were astonished. It hadn't crossed their mind that this man might be married, because he was so often, having dalliances with various different women that he encountered.
I think he would have appreciated the character of Tom Paris in Voyager, wouldn't he?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Flirty Fly-Boy, basically. That was who he was. Yeah.
Fly-Boy.
Yeah, totally.
And that's it, and there are numerous characters who, Roddenberry, not just obviously Kirk in his different, ways, but there were numerous characters that would crop up in the original series and the early seasons of Next Generation, like things like in the outrageous Okona, that kind of really sort of roue kind of character, the charmer, and then, it extends to characters like Riker as well. It goes all the way through to those maybe it's a little bit of wish fulfillment on Roddenberry's part. These spacemen flyboys are all that. Again, it's that kind of, boy's own kind of flirtatious pilot, life that he's recreated and reliving through Star Trek.
Absolutely. Well, and I think in Star Trek you see again and again there is this kind of the pilot has a sort of special place in a way. I mean, I'm thinking of both Picard and Riker, although they're kind of on the command track. At various points, it's kind of pointed out to us that they are highly skilled pilots. If it comes to crunch time, there's the one episode, isn't there, where Picard takes the helm because he wants to take responsibility, and there's no question that he's a highly skilled pilot and perfectly capable of flying the ship. And in Chain of Command, there's the situation where Riker is basically the captain who's taken over, is forced to go to him because he needs the best pilot that he can get, and that actually is not whoever's operating the helm day by day. It's Riker. He's the best pilot on the ship. So there's this kind of sense that even though they've moved beyond the act of actually piloting the ship, in a way akin to piloting a plane, and moved into this sort of slightly more, well, not hands-off, but a slightly a level back, a kind of command level, a kind of more managerial level, that they still do have this, what's represented as almost a kind of, I'm thinking of Tom Paris in particular, it's a kind of, it's not just a skill, it's kind of a gift, is the way that it's represented, isn't it? If you think of Paris in Voyager, it's, he's really, at the beginning of the show, he's a bit of a wastrel, he's a bit of a troublemaker, but he has this kind of gift that can't be taught, and therefore he's the guy that they've got to go to, because no one else can do it. So I suppose all through Star Trek, in a way, we see that kind of sort of fetish of the pilot in a way, and the kind of that they've got something special about them. And I suppose that ties into this idea of this kind of charisma, this sex appeal, this whole aura that the pilots have around them, and that Roddenberry was familiar with himself.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of truth to that. His wartime story is quite different from that of one of his main actors in the show, James Doohan, who obviously played Scotty, the legendary Scotty. Why don't you tell us a little bit about his wartime journey, Duncan? Because it's a very different kind of story, isn't it?
It is absolutely a very different story. Yeah, James Doohan, actually, we can read quite a lot about his war experiences because he wrote a really fantastic memoir with Peter David, the Star Trek novelist. A really great book. Both you and I were struggling to get hold of a copy in time for this recording, and we were really, our bacon was saved by I hope this is how you pronounce your name, Dave Kilari, on the Babel conference. We put out a shout out saying, look, we can't get hold of this book, it's out of print, can anyone help us? And it's a fascinating story, I'd really recommend it. And he tells the story of his service in the Royal Canadian Artillery, starting as a gunner. A lot of that experience, he came over to England, basically. He said basically he was bored. He was waiting around a lot of the time. He said we were stuck going to pubs, eating fish and chips, drinking warm beer, and really not seeing any service. And he started to get quite frustrated. He was, year in, year out, he'd gradually get sort of promoted a bit here and there. But really, he hadn't seen any action. He hadn't done anything. And he was feeling a bit frustrated by it, in a sense. One thing that he did experience while he was stationed in England, though, was he says this is where he met the inspiration for Scotty. He was sharing some quarters in Catterick in Yorkshire with a man called Andrew who came from Aberdeen. And he said that to begin with, he literally couldn't understand a word this guy was saying, but he gradually got his ear into the accent and started to sort of appreciate it and started to learn how to mimic it himself. And he claims that in the early years of Star Trek, actually, he started off trying to do Scotty with a really accurate recreation of this guy's Aberdeen accent. But basically, Gene Roddenberry and the other executives said to him, look, you can't do that. No one will understand a word you're saying. You've got to pull the accent back a bit. So that was sort of James Doohan's excuse for why Scotty's accent in the original series maybe not the most accurate Scottish accent, but that it was a kind of compromise designed to appeal to the American audience.
That means, I'll tell you what, though, about that. I never knew he was Canadian till I was much, much older than a kid. I did think he was Scottish for years and years and years, and then when I read he was Canadian, I was like, oh, wow. Like a genuine... So, maybe it was just me having a bit of tin ear for, Scottish accents or whatever, even though I am part Scottish myself, so that's not very good. He did a good job despite that, I think.
Well, it's quite a sort of... I don't know, I think there is a sort of a slightly kind of an American idea of a Scottish accent. I'm thinking of like Scrooge McDuck as well. It's another kind of version of that. There's a sort of, and I suppose, I don't know, I grew up in London. If that's what you sort of see and hear on TV or whatever, you kind of accept that maybe that's reasonable. I don't know what we should ask Lee Hutchison what he makes of James Doohan's accent, because obviously Simon Pegg's accent is quite different in a sense. Is maybe a bit more realistic, at least, whereas James Doohan's is quite a sort of... there's something quite kind of Hollywood about it. Do you know what I mean? There's something quite sort of... It's a bit like a mask, somehow. But anyway, he's a guy with a great facility for accents. He perfected a lot of other accents while he was here. And he talks quite a bit about his voice and kind of picking up different voices and so on, which obviously is something that carries through to his Star Trek career. I'm thinking of the animated series in particular, but also in the original series, he played at least one other voice role, I think, didn't he? And his voice was obviously very important to him as an actor. And he tells this story, actually, that he was sent for officer training, and so he was commissioned as a lieutenant or a lieutenant, I suppose. I don't know how the Canadians pronounce that. We'd call it a lieutenant. And Field Marshal Montgomery came to inspect the troops, and James Doohan had to basically sort of call them all to attention. So he bellowed out to them, and they all snapped to attention. And he said Montgomery walked down the aisle and said, "Good voice." And that was a great, for him, that was kind of the highest praise, in a sense, was that this Field Marshal had complimented him on his voice.
He did do it. I'm trying to recall now the other accent he did. I can't remember what it is now, but I know he did more. So he had a big career in radio as well before he did Star Trek. During the 40s, he did thousands of radio plays. So I think that was one of his ways into acting after the war. So I think he obviously had this facility, didn't he, to sort of mimic and to bring on these voices. And it's interesting how that was forged through his experiences as a soldier and through meeting all these different people. So, and I think one of the big things with him as a performer, as Scotty, is that he managed to, even if his accent wasn't necessarily traditional and accurate, he managed to, like you say, in a Hollywood kind of way, an American style kind of way, he managed to get across the feel of a Scotsman, even if it is a bit cliche. He did get across that level he brought that character out, even given the fact he didn't really have a lot to do or always, you know, in the episodes. But he still managed to make that distinctive mark. So it's that whole thing of picking up from real life experience and taking that real life experience into what you do as an artist.
And I mean, I suppose that's one thing that people, you know, do find with the military. You get, you know, travel the world, experience new things and so on. I mean, he said he'd never been on a boat before until he took this long voyage to Liverpool to go and train in England. So, you know, it's for a young man, it's kind of an eye-opening experience. The other thing for James Doohan is he was getting away from a family situation that was very difficult. His father was quite violent and unpleasant. So there was an element of kind of, you know, he was sort of joining the forces and he was getting away from all that and starting to find a way to kind of make his own mark in the world, which I suppose is why there was this real frustration for him and for a lot of soldiers at the time that they weren't being used. You know, basically they were biding their time, waiting for this, you know, waiting for D-Day, waiting for this event that everyone knew was on the horizon, but it just seemed to keep being sort of put off, and they were never quite sure when it was going to happen. And then, of course, it did happen. And, you know, he says in the book, it's quite kind of ironic in a way that he'd been in the forces for about 5 years, really, by the time he saw his first real engagement. And that engagement was D-Day, you know, the biggest engagement of the war, pretty much, the most crucial moment of the war. So should we talk a little bit about James Doohan's D-Day experiences? Because those are that's the real heart of his war story, I suppose. That's the one that we see, you know, reposted again and again on the internet, and really told this quite remarkable story of what happened to him.
Yeah, obviously it was D-Day, which, as most people will know, was the Allied invasion of France on June the 6th, 1944. So you had the British, the Americans and the Canadians each being assigned areas of the Normandy beaches in order to, you know, begin this invasion. So the Canadian element were allocated an area which, and there's a few French names coming up here that I'm going to talk about, so I may hash these up pronounce-wise, so I apologise if there are any French listeners, which there may be, or French-Canadian listeners. The Canadians were allocated an area from a village called Courcey, I've probably got that wrong, all the way to a place called Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer, which was codenamed Juno Beach. And Doohan's division was to secure the Caen-Bayeux Road and take the Carpiquet Airport, which was west of Caen. So it was a difficult mission because you had two battalions. You had the German 716th Infantry Division, and there were troops from the 21st Panzer Division. So they were holed up near Caen, and the Germans had strewn the beaches with anti-tank mines. So they were really not making this easy for them, even though the Allies had prepared before. Planes had blasted the German positions. The idea was that the Canadians wouldn't be visible as they were going through. But it didn't quite go to plan. So the bombardment from the air by the Allies didn't quite happen in the way they wanted to. There was bad weather, visibility wasn't very good, the pilots didn't quite get their targets right. So the coastal defences at Juno weren't really taken care of. The landings were delayed as well, due to high waves and bad weather. After the sun had risen on June the 6th, there was no cover of darkness by the time they landed. So it was difficult. So James Doohan was pretty worried. You know, he was scared of being at sea. He even said later, a long time after, he said, we were more afraid of drowning than we were of the Germans.
and many men did drown on that day. I mean, you know, trying to get into the beach, especially because they were laden down with equipment and so on. And the conditions were bad. A lot of men didn't even make it ashore, you know, really tragically didn't even kind of get a start in the fight. And then, you know, I mean, if you've seen Saving Private Ryan, you know the kind of situation that James Doohan was going into. You know, they were being shot at, there were shells going off all over the place. I mean, they're trying to get a relatively short distance up the beach, but he says in his book, you know, that I think he says that 75 yards could have been 7,500 yards, and the sand by this point had been so, you know, blown apart and the water had got all over it and so on. It was thick, kind of, you know, muddy consistency almost. They were kind of trying to wade through the beach in a sense. He said it was like walking through snow. So laden down with equipment, you know, being shot at, a really terrible situation to be in, and a bit of a miracle, to be honest, that actually he was in charge of 33. I mean, he was in charge of more men generally, but he was with a small unit of 33 men. All of them were specialists of various kinds that he was kind of immediately commanding on that day. And actually they all managed to get through safely in one piece and make it to the sand dunes and to some kind of cover, you know, without being hit by the Germans, which was quite remarkable, frankly. And obviously, as we know, a lot of men weren't that lucky that day. You know, there were a terrible rate of casualties. But they managed to get through. So they got through this first experience of battle. They got through in one piece. But then what happened was, so there was a kind of period of calm. And then one of the more interesting incidents in James Doohan's story comes up a little bit later, which was that they'd had a period of calm, and then suddenly they started being shot at, and they couldn't work out, you know, where were the bullets coming from, what was going on. So he took a pair of binoculars and he had a look around, and he managed to see a couple of Germans in a tower who were shooting a machine gun. And so he told one of his men, I'll keep an eye on them through the binoculars, you take a shot at them, see if you can take them out, basically, these Germans. And his friend had a go and didn't manage to do it. You know, he could see he wasn't hitting. The Germans didn't even seem to know that he was there. I mean, I should say they weren't targeting James Doohan's group specifically. They were kind of firing all over the place, but he'd identified that was where the bullets were coming from. So he was keen to take them out. And he realised that the rifle the guy was using was one that he knew well. He knew he was a good shot with it. So he said to him, look, I tell you what, you take the binoculars and I'll take the rifle and I'll take the shot. And he'd never, you know, he was saying basically he'd been in the forces for 5 years. He'd never used a weapon against someone before. He'd never tried to kill someone before. So it was quite a bridge to cross in a sense. But he talks about it in his memoir, and he said basically, you know, that was the job. You had to do the job. You couldn't question it. So he did. He took it. The first shot missed. The second shot, one of the Germans went down. He took a third shot. The other German went down. And he thought to himself, you know, have I killed them? Are they wounded? Are they dead? But ultimately, the machine gun stopped firing, and that was his job, and he couldn't really dwell on that anymore. But obviously, you know, an experience like that is going to affect you. He'd gone into the forces, and he says because he'd had this experience with this quite abusive father, he'd actually gone into the Signal Corps to begin with, because he didn't really want to be in a position where he was having to kill people. He wanted to sort of do a more sort of support role, more kind of logistical role, you know, still doing important work, but not literally on the front line killing people. And yet he'd come to this situation. That was the job he had to do, and he most likely had killed these two men. Yeah, and it must have been quite a shock, really, that he was... you know, that he was put in that position. But, you know, it's that kind of thing. You have to do it. You know, when you're in the middle of that situation, you have to do it. So these were his first two kills in the entire war. So it was quite a big moment for him, really. It got even more intense for him, though, than this, because in the end, they managed to clear a lot of the German contingent out. As you said, there was this level of calm that had set up on Juno Beach, and there were lots of Canadians there, and it would have seemed like they had a bit of respite, but it was evening. It was around 11:20, and he was having a cigarette. James Doohan was having a cigarette, and as he tells it, he finished the cigarette, patted the silver cigarette case that he kept in his breast pocket. His brother had given him it as a good luck charm. So it was quite a symbolic thing for him. As he was heading back then, a few minutes later from his cigarette break, he was shot 6 times. 4 bullets slammed into his leg, 1 whacked him in the chest, and the 6th took off his right middle finger, which is pretty impressive. Didn't he get shot more than once in the finger as well? He claims he could see the marks from 3 bullets in his... I don't quite understand how that's possible. I don't understand how 3 bullets can hit one finger and there's any finger left, but I don't know. That's what he says. Anyway, he said he didn't quite realise that. At first he just felt he'd been sort of shoved. He didn't even realise he'd been shot. And even when he saw his, you know, bleeding finger, he didn't really realise that... He didn't realise he'd been shot in the leg until he got to the, you know, field medic, and they were patching him up, and they patched up the finger, and then he was going to go off and, you know, kind of go back to work, basically. And they said, oh, hang on, you know, just hold on a minute, you've been shot in your leg as well. And he was astounded. He hadn't even noticed until they started pulling bullets out of his leg. So, you know, obviously he was a bit sort of, you know, knocked for 6 by it. And so after that, obviously he had to be taken back to hospital, to go back to hospital in England. They had to, the finger, basically, they started by just amputating the very end of the finger. But then what they found was that when they x-rayed it, the sort of joints in the middle of the finger, all the bones were shattered, and he had no control over the finger. It was kind of stuck rigid. So basically they said to him, look, either we can kind of amputate the rest of the finger, or we can leave it, but essentially he'd be going around, you know, giving people the finger all the time, because he couldn't ever... It was permanently straightened, what was left of his finger. So he describes... I mean, it's quite funny, his memoir. He's got a great sense of humour. So he describes this kind of real dilemma. What would I rather? I'd rather lose the finger or go around kind of insulting people with this rude gesture everywhere I go. And in the end, he decided that it'd be better to amputate it and to lose the rest of the finger. And there are, I believe, episodes of the original series where you can see, I mean, they try their best to hide this, but there are, moments, if you kind of freeze frame it, where you can see his missing finger in the shot, because it kind of snuck in one way or another.
Well, he was lucky that that's all he lost, because in the end, it was his brother's cigarette case that saved his life, because the bullet that hit him in the chest hit that cigarette case. He did joke that it was the only time being a smoker saved his life.
Absolutely. I mean, it's such a sort of cliche, the life saved by a cigarette case, but it seemingly did happen to a lot of people. And I think he was aware of how close he'd come to to dying, obviously, and he describes as well, it's quite a moving description of the first real, we talked about this first encounter of killing the German soldiers. He also saw that day his first, really gruesome casualty of war. Another one of the Canadians, this guy who was basically on the verge of death. He said his insides were falling out of him, basically. He'd been dosed up on morphine, so he wasn't in pain. He was just sort of staring into the distance. And he said he looked at him and he just thought, that could have been me. It could so easily have been me. But he said that, again, that was something that he just had to kind of shut down those thoughts, not really dwell on that at the time, and kind of get on with the job, because really you couldn't go there. But writing the book, he says that even however many decades later, he could still see that man vividly. That kind of memory of that sort of horror never left him. And I suppose this is the sort of thing that maybe it's useful to bear in mind when you talk about Roddenberry, or you talk about James Doohan, or the people who've served in the war and have seen these awful things, that when they then come to something like Star Trek, which is quite a kind of, for the most part, quite sort of light entertainment, particularly the original series, and it deals with battle, and it deals with war and wounds and death and so on, but in a generally not particularly upsetting way, that obviously it informs that if you've had those experiences, let alone it informs your views on war, your views on the chain of command. I mean, Roddenberry, I know, had some experiences in his service where which sort of demonstrated flaws in the chain of command. And if you think of the original series and all the admirals and commodores and all these sort of mistakes being made further up the chain, and not trusting the guy on the ground and not trusting the captain who knows what he's talking about, those kind of stories would be informed by some of those experiences, by seeing men lose their lives because someone higher up the chain of command has made a stupid decision, or has not listened to advice from someone who knows what they're talking about.
That is actually quite a recurring trope in many Star Trek series, isn't it? And going on, there are a lot of characters that you do find who do come in with rank, and status, and they are flawed, or they are corrupt, or they are wrong about things, and they come and they don't, like you say, they don't trust the men on the ground. It's interesting. It is a recurring thing, even beyond Roddenberry's death. It's something that's a lot in Star Trek. A lot of emphasis is placed on being able to trust the people on the ground, the captains, the crew, being able to trust these people who are out there on the front lines, serving, seeing everything up close. So that probably was informed by these kind of experiences. There were more people involved in wartime experiences, though, in the original Star Trek, wasn't there? There was DeForest Kelley was one, Gene Coon. There were a few different people, weren't there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have to say, I'd love to hear if anyone on the Babel conference has got more information on any of these stories. I'd love to hear it, because all I was managing to find was it's fairly brief on each of them, but just to run through a few of them. So DeForest Kelley served in the United States Army Air Force from 1943, but he was actually assigned to a motion picture unit. So he was basically working, he was not on the front lines getting shot. He was working on, propaganda films, training films, that kind of thing. So really very much in the kind of, in the sort of Hollywood, in the way, the kind of the way of filmmaking and so on. All the producers, the main producers on Star Trek all served in the war. Bob Justman, he was in the US Navy, and actually served as a radio man, third class, which was, a kind of communications role, a bit like James Doohan being in the Signal Corps, it was to do with communications. Gene Coon was a Marine. He served from 1942, and and then he served again in the war in Korea. So he'd had even more military service than some of them. And Fred Freiberger, who was the sort of ill-fated producer in the third season, had actually he was stationed in England, like James Doohan, and was actually shot down over Germany and spent 2 years as a prisoner of war. So he'd really, gone through the whole kind of the whole sort of military experience in that way. So it's kind of interesting just thinking these people working on this show, they have this background in common. A lot of them have this background in common. Obviously, the younger members of the cast, Shatner and Nimoy, for example, a little bit too young. They would have memories of the war, but they weren't old enough to be serving. So really, there's that sort of generational difference in a sense between the men of the just slightly older generation who had really been through this in quite a real way. They've been to war and they've come back again, someone like James Doohan, compared to the slightly younger members of the cast who maybe had just been a little bit too young to actually experience that firsthand.
All of these actors and all of these creative forces behind Star Trek, it goes on to inform elements of the series, doesn't it? Because we're going to talk a little bit about some of the episodes which either directly reference the Second World War or have certain parallels to some of these experiences and some of the overarching themes of the war that cropped up in the original series. One episode in particular deals quite head on with this, and that's the episode Patterns of Force.
Absolutely. I mean, Patterns of Force is a very, very blatant allegory in a sense of the Nazi regime in the Second World War. I mean, basically what happens is there's a man, it's a sort of Prime Directive story. There's a man who's been supposed to be observing this culture, and instead he's kind of basically corrupted it. We discover he's a historian, and he's come up with a spellbindingly stupid idea that basically if he can, as he sees it, take the kind of good part of Nazism, of fascism, i.e. like the trains running on time, the efficiency. He talks about the Nazi state as being the most efficient state in the world, and kind of keep away all the brutality and oppression and murder and all the kind of nasty sides of it. Then he sort of feels he can create this kind of perfect society, and so he sets himself up as this Führer. And it's very much this planet, in the kind of original series way that they go to a planet and that they all look like humans and they dress like humans and so on. You've basically got this whole planet dressed up as Nazis, and the Nazis are in a conflict with another group of people who are very much sort of identified with the Jews. They're called their planet is called Zion, i.e. Zion. They have very biblical Jewish names, Abram and Isaac, i.e. Abraham and Isaac. And there's discussion about the way they're being treated, about their oppression, and about this final solution of dealing with them.
It's really quite shocking in a way, watching it now. In fact, it was banned in Germany until the 90s. They wouldn't show it on German TV, obviously because of, the specific visuals of Nazis, but also the fact that Spock, towards the end, actually shows an element of not respect, but certain appreciation for what the character of John Gill, who's Kirk's professor at the academy, who then becomes the Führer in inverted commas, some sort of level of admiration for what he's attempting to do, and attempting to. He says, it is the most efficient model of government, and the Germans wouldn't allow that to be broadcast for decades. And to hear Spock say that is. I mean, it's obvious there's not any anti-Semitism going on or any, leanings towards fascism. Not at all. Nothing in this story is about promoting fascism or about suggesting that the idea of the Nazi ideal is right. In fact, rather the contrary. But hearing it is quite remarkable coming from a character such as Spock and coming from a show which is only, just over 20 years removed from the war. It feels like, in a way, the writers and Roddenberry trying to figure out a way to make, in some respects, make what happened more palatable in its own way and make what happened have more of an actual reason beyond genocide and madness and horror, and trying to figure out what is the ultimate building blocks behind what became fascism. I think Spock mentions National Socialism. And if you take it to the political, theoretic extremes, socialism is removed from fascism. Fascism is the ultimate expression of that in a way. The idea of a socialist, and it goes obviously towards communism as well, the idea of a socialist idea isn't one made up of brutality and death and murder and genocide. So it feels like they're trying to work that out in this episode.
It is. I mean, definitely, I suppose there's a controversial aspect to it. And like you say, it was banned in Germany until, only a few years ago. I think they first actually broadcast it on TV. And in part, I think, I mean, they have quite strict rules about these things. But in part, I think there's just the visual shock of seeing Kirk and Spock. They both dress up. I mean, Spock is in a Wehrmacht uniform. Kirk is in a Gestapo uniform. They're both dressed up as Nazis. They have to do the Nazi salute. They have to Heil the Führer. And the kind of visual iconography of that is just very shocking, especially from these characters that we know well and we identify with. And I think for Shatner and Nimoy, it must have been very strange as well, because both of them were from Jewish families. I mean, they were too young, obviously, to serve in the war. But if you read Shatner's book, for example, he talks about Nimoy's father telling him about the Holocaust, and when things were going on, basically, saying they're killing Jews, they're killing people like us. And there was a real feeling, he says, this could have been us. This could have been happening to us if we'd been in a different situation. Both their families had come from Ukraine, before the war. So they were in America, in Nimoy's case, in Boston, and in Canada, in Shatner's case. But they had relatives back home. They had people they knew back home who were being affected by it more directly. And also they both experienced a degree of, anti-Semitic bullying at school, being called names and so on. They'd experienced levels of anti-Semitism in their own lives, let alone knowing what had happened in the Holocaust and, learning about the horrific things that had happened thanks to the Germans. So obviously for them, it must have been a very strange experience, dressing up in these Nazi uniforms, playing along, which is kind of what they have to do in the story in order to kind of go undercover and so on. I don't know, it must have been you'd think it might have been quite uncomfortable in some ways for them to be taking part in this story, which is not to say that they shouldn't have done the story or there's anything wrong with that exactly. I mean, it is an allegory. It's very, there are certainly elements of it that work quite well. It's, it's quite well done in some ways, but it is quite uncomfortable to watch. Even for us today, there's a kind of shock value in it.
Yeah, a little bit. And you talking about how they might have reacted to filming this. There's the scene I was thinking of the scene where one of the Nazi characters, one of the Ecosians, I think they're called, the oppressors, is talking, he's suggesting Spock is inferior because of his alien features, because of his ears and things like this. And it is almost like a Nazi prowling round a Jew, suggesting that because of, the way the Jew stands or the way the Jew, their teeth or whatever, all the things that they basically destroyed as part of the Jewish person, and all the things they suggested were inferior and racially inferior and all these kind of things. It's sort of reflected in that scene, but from a Vulcan, perspective and an alien. I mean, they look like humans, but they are aliens. But it's that ultimate sort of, prejudice based on how someone looks and how someone seeing Nimoy, he does it with the old quirk Spock eyebrow, and there's the element of, but he must have been thinking at the time, yeah, this is allegory at its most potent, really. Mm-hmm.
Well, there's the irony, of course, as well, that, of course, when you talk about the Vulcans, actually the Vulcans are very clearly superior, physically. I mean, in that kind of Nazi, way of looking at things from a sort of eugenic perspective or whatever. They're stronger, they're smarter, they have extra abilities that they have, they're tougher in certain ways, physically they can withstand a lot more. And yet, as you say, they're different, and Spock's ears, obviously, as in many episodes, are this kind of marker of difference that pick him out in a way. One of the things that struck me about it, though, is that, I mean, just talking about this kind of shock value of seeing them dressed up like that, I feel like in entertainment there is this kind of, and in our culture generally, there's something about the Nazi uniforms that is slightly kind of fetishized and that people get quite excited about. I mean, I've found, I'm working at the moment on this book on the occupation of Guernsey, and I when I was there, obviously, went to museums and so on, and of course there are uniforms in the museums, that's one thing, but I did go to see one guy who had this sort of private collection. He wanted to show me his collection of kind of war memorabilia, and I thought, okay, fair enough, that's interesting. But actually going into his house and seeing all these kind of Nazi uniforms that he'd carefully preserved and all these, Nazi pistols and things, it freaked me out a bit. And I started to think, is there something a bit sinister about this? Because why is it that we're so sort of... There is a kind of attraction to it, and part of it is that there was at the time, I mean, talking to these people who lived through the occupation there, especially children, especially boys, maybe not really thinking about the broader context, maybe not really thinking about the war and that side of it, but they see these, men in these very smart uniforms. They're very well dressed. They're quite aspirational figures for those people, and they even start dressing up as them and trying to construct their own sort of, cosplay. Basically, sort of Nazi cosplay was going on in the Channel Islands in the war, but. Which to us thinking about is sort of horrific, but at the same time, I think we do have this kind of fascination with that sort of iconography, and you see it later in Star Trek as well. You see it in Voyager and the Killing Game. You see it in Enterprise. Both Brannon Braga stories. I think Brannon Braga is exactly an example of that kind of approach, which is not a million miles away from this man whose private collection freaked me out. That. He talked about doing that Voyager episode, The Killing Game, where where they had the Hirogen dressed up as Nazis, and that was the idea. That was his kind of pitch: was let's get some aliens and dress them up as Nazis, and it'll look really cool. And then he said basically, and then they worked on the story, and they tried to develop a story that actually kind of meant something in the end. But that was the initial idea, and I think at the end of season 3 of Enterprise, you see the same thing. He literally throws the same trick out again. We see an alien in a Nazi uniform, and it's famously it was this kind of gesture of like, well, screw you guys. I'm out. Basically, I'm going to set up this bizarre cliffhanger with a very, powerful final image, and I have no idea and couldn't care less what kind of story you make of it. But it's kind of the same thing. Basically, it's just the visual impact of that thing and the idea that there's something kind of cool and exciting about it. And and that's not to say those stories don't work. I mean, I think they're both good stories in their ways. But I do think there's this sort of slight aspect of this fascination with the iconography of the Nazi state because it was so extreme, the swastikas and the uniforms and the shining boots and everything that, I do think is slightly questionable in some ways. And it's sort of almost played on in the episode because you have this... McCoy is sort of beamed down in a rush, and they have to source a uniform for him from the. Apparently, the Enterprise has a costume department on board, which is quite interesting because Kirk asks them to call through to the uniform section and get McCoy the right uniform, and he's struggling to get his boots on and so on, and not really kind of a sort of living up to the smart kind of Nazi look. But there's definitely this kind of issue about is it cool to be dressed up in these uniforms? However much there's a sort of, there is a kind of thrill about it and there is a kind of power to it and so on. But really, when we think about it, they represent something quite reprehensible and awful, and maybe there's something a tiny bit sort of irresponsible about that.
Maybe they thought this far distant, from the war, I mean, it's not, from our terms, it's not very far away, 20 years, but maybe they thought at this point they were able to get away with making that parallel, but making it very on the nose. I mean, Star Trek beyond that, I mean, you only have to look at Deep Space Nine. That's one big, Germany Jewish parallel, with Cardassians and Bajor. But they didn't, they did have similar sort of, in some respects, kind of iconography in a way. The Cardassians had a very sort of Nazi way about them, but they didn't dress up like Nazis. You didn't have like the same uniforms being used. It was allegory. In this case, they actually use a visual from Earth, from, the war, that are on human bodies, like you mentioned, Braga later did it on aliens, but in this case it's humans. They are alien species, but they might as well be humans, just on a different planet. So it's doing that there is an element of shock value. There is an element, I think, of them trying to, beat you over the head with the idea. And that's why I think as an episode, it's not particularly a really good one. Partly because of that. When I'm watching it, I'm not thinking this is great drama. I'm thinking, okay, I get the point you're trying to make. You're making it very, very explicitly. And while it's got some interesting, like I said, the undercurrent of political idea in it and the suggestions of socialism and fascism and all this and what John Gillies trying to do is interesting. But I think that the manner of the story and quite how, like I say, it beats you over the head with the Nazi uniforms just makes me think that it could have been more subtle. And I know subtlety isn't a word that you associate with 60 Star Trek, but I think Star Trek learned that lesson better as the years went by, really. I
mean, I don't mind it as an episode. I feel it loses its way a little bit in the second half somehow. But initially, I think they work quite well with the kind of they do work well with the initial shock value when Kirk and Spock beam down to the planet and they start to realise what's going on there and they start to see some of the brutality. There's a guy beaten up in the street and so on, and they see the uniforms and they see the iconography and they see the propaganda films and so on. I feel like all the sort of setup is all reasonably well done and quite involving. Once it gets more into the plot and the resolution of the plot, which is all about finding out what's happened to this Federation guy and how these events have unfolded in this way, it slightly loses me, to be honest, and it kind of drags a little bit in the second half, maybe.
It's probably the most key original series episode to actually hit you over the head with the war and the allegory of the war and trying to talk about that. I think the other one that really I wanted to talk about briefly is one of the most classic Star Trek episodes ever, The City on the Edge of Forever, which was the Harlan Ellison written story, which most people who've watched Star Trek know the story. It's simply McCoy trips on some cordrazine, heads off onto a planet, goes through the Guardian of Forever, this mysterious time portal, ends up back in the 1930s, and inadvertently saves the life of Edith Keeler, who is a character played by Joan Collins, who ultimately, the ripple effect of her being saved is that the Nazis win the war. And it's then Kirk and Spock having to come back, and Kirk falls in love with Edith, only to discover this, as they're saving McCoy, only to discover that in order for time to go on the course it should and to save everybody, Edith has to die. It's a great episode with a really interesting backstory of Harlan Ellison is a very difficult character by all accounts. And there's a really fascinating backstory as to the original script that was written and all kinds of things. But I think what I find really interesting about this, besides the fact it's a great episode, is that it's talking about the idea, and it's a Star Trek episode that talks about the idea of what if, it's a great classic what if scenario, what if a pacifist had such an effect on the United States government that they didn't get involved in the war. And that's ultimately what happens. Edith is a pacifist, and her surviving, she ends up getting so far into success that she ends up in the White House, and she influences Roosevelt and says, don't go into the war. And the Americans not getting involved in the war leads to the Nazis developing the nuclear bomb, the A-bomb first, and dropping it on America, and everything's different. Everything changes. So it's a really interesting commentary on the idea of pacifism and the idea of what would have happened if things had gone differently in the 30s. What if a pacifist movement had got involved and actually convinced the Americans, even after something like Pearl Harbor, don't go in there, don't get involved, because there's until the Americans got involved, the British and the Allies, they were losing, really, and this is the thing. That was the turning point of the war, the famous turning point of the war. What would have happened if that hadn't happened? And I think that's what I really like about this episode. It doesn't dwell on it massively. It's much more of a sort of an adventure kind of romance time travel story, really. But I like the undercurrent of what it's trying to say there, and the fact that they're thinking about the what-if scenario of the war, and if things had gone differently.
I mean, it's interesting. Obviously, we know Harlan Ellison was very unhappy about the changes that were made to the script and so on. And I think one of the things he wasn't happy about was this shift towards representing Edith Keeler as a peace activist, which I think wasn't in his original story in that way. And I suppose the issue is that there is a sort of implication of the episode. I mean, I think for most people watching the episode, the thing that grabs you is more what it's like for Kirk to make this, to make this kind of sacrifice, basically to let someone die that he's fallen in love with, in order for history to be set right again. And to my mind, it's not really making a value judgment about whether she was right or wrong to be preaching pacifism or so on. And Spock says she had the right ideas, but she had them at the wrong time. So it's not exactly, it's not an anti-pacifist message in a sense. But I think Harlan Ellison felt, because this was going on at the same time as Vietnam, he was involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement. I think he felt that there was a kind of implication that it was sort of allying itself with this attitude of, well, pacifism's all very well and good. That's a kind of idealistic philosophy, but in the real world, sometimes we have to make tough decisions. We have to, we have to fight the wars. Basically, what sometimes you have to do terrible things. I mean, Kirk says in Patterns of Force, he describes Nazism as, he says, it was brutal and perverted. It had to be destroyed at a terrible cost. And I suppose that's the kind of the question that kind of lingers over that episode. Maybe is it sort of suggesting that I suppose that her pacifism was at fault because it caused Nazi Germany to win the Second World War, which on one level is sort of what we're being told is what happened? Or is it more just kind of the butterfly effect, and one thing here has an unpredictable effect, and it's not really possible to make a value judgment on that? It's more just recognising that history happens in strange ways, and surprising events can ensue from one thing leading to another.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, is it sort of, is an episode like this, and if that commentary is the case, that Ellison wasn't happy with, of suggesting that the pacifist element wouldn't really, the peace movement element wouldn't really get you anywhere in the long run. Is that the legacy of Roddenberry and Doohan and Kuhn and all of these guys, and Justman, and all the things they went through, which, from our distant viewpoint, we can't possibly imagine what that was like, growing up, long after this. Our grandfathers would have served in the war. We can't imagine it as much as we learn about it and we talk about it. Is that the legacy of it? Did they come out of the war thinking, well, the ends justify the means? You have to make these hard choices. And even though Star Trek's a very progressive vision of the future, and, as we talked about in the last episode, Roddenberry had a very sort of utopian idea, and he wanted all these different races to come together and be forged ahead, and think bigger than the kind of conflicts we did. But he's ultimately the message that they couldn't quite escape the idea that, there is an inevitability in war, even despite the fact that Star Trek is all about trying to look past our own human flaws, in a way.
Absolutely, and I suppose this idea of that they got there in the end, in a sense. In the future, everything is that it doesn't need to be like that anymore. I mean, when Spock says she had the right ideas but at the wrong time, they're the right ideas for the 23rd century, but they were the wrong. But I suppose that's what he's saying. They were the wrong ideas for the 20th century. And I suppose coming from someone or for an audience, 20 years later, who are embroiled, the country's embroiled in another war, which is very much less obviously morally justified than the Second World War. That maybe that is quite a statement. It's a provocative statement in a sense.
Yeah, and maybe it's a statement that further grounds the original Star Trek in its time. In that sense, in that you have to think of the wider, real life political events going on, the wider, 60s kind of movement, to think of it in those terms. And it's interesting to look at it from that perspective, really.
It's interesting as well, I think, that, we see, I mean, you say, this is City on the Edge Forever is an episode about the Second World War, and it is, in a sense, because that's the key historical event that this break in the timelines hinges on. But it's kind of also typical in that it doesn't actually engage directly with the war. And in some ways, although Star Trek is fascinated with the Second World War, it never quite treats it head on. Either it deals with it allegorically, so even Patterns of Force, which is the most kind of blatant, it is essentially an allegory. It's happening on another planet. Their setup is a kind of replication of Nazi Germany, but they're not going back in time to Nazi Germany. Another episode we could talk about is The Conscience of the King, which deals with an instance of genocide, a kind of Holocaust in a sense. But again, that's dealt with in the kind of Star Trek allegorical sense. City on the Edge of Forever, they actually go back to a time that isn't experiencing the war. It's sort of safely before the war, but it's going to affect it. And even in later Star Trek, if you think about, the episodes that we talked about, Voyager and Enterprise, the Voyager episode, it all takes place on the holodeck. The Enterprise episode, it does take place on Earth, but it's in an alternate timeline, and that timeline gets kind of wiped out by the end of the episode. So it's striking in some ways that, given that Star Trek does do time travel stories, they go back to other time periods, and given that they're so fascinated by the Second World War and the iconography of the Second World War and the kind of stories that you can tell there, that they always find a way of skirting around the issue some way by kind of making it safe by actually, it's kind of about the Second War, but it's not quite daring to present it.
Possibly because it's still raw, and as I worry, Duncan, and I'm sure you do as well as a lover of history, that the messages of the war are becoming increasingly lost these days, and the legacy of the war is becoming increasingly ignored. But it has been raw throughout the last 60, 70 years, and I think that there's always been that element of, if you hit it head on, what are you gonna find? How many people are you going to offend? Are you going to prevent a country from showing your episode for 30 years? Are you going to alienate a lot of your fan base because you're maybe touching a little bit close to home? So that's possibly why Star Trek does always skirt the edges, without completely ignoring it.
And we see that as well with, I mean, you know, in our lifetime, something like 9/11. I mean, obviously, you know, maybe in a future episode, we'll probably come back and talk about how Enterprise dealt with 9/11. And it's interesting the way that obviously they ran the Xindi story, which is a big kind of 9/11 story. Before that, there were a few sort of tentative gestures in that direction. But around that time, you know, a lot of TV programs obviously felt this responsibility. They felt this huge event in the world, in world history, had taken place, and they had to find a way to reflect that, and they weren't quite sure, you know, they're sort of feeling their way how to respond to it, how best to incorporate that within their own program. And you know, I remember there was you know, in comic books there was a discussion about you know, how would Superman deal, why wasn't Superman there to stop 9/11? Do you know what I mean? And this kind of like, how do you kind of reconcile a historical event which is so kind of cataclysmic and so, you know, real in the real world, in a sense that impacts so many people, with these fictions that then try to find a way of sort of incorporating it in some way, but without it seeming kind of insensitive, and without it seeming, you know, obviously if in Enterprise they'd literally gone back to, you know, to 9/11 as a time travel story, I think people would have found that very upsetting. They would have found that very difficult. But obviously they found a way in the kind of traditional Star Trek allegorical way of telling a story that kind of shone a light on that in certain kind of allegorical ways in that tradition. And maybe that was the closest that we saw to patterns of force for people who'd lived through the Second World War.
Yeah, and I think they never really got closer, as we've said, and I think it is part of the legacy in Star Trek of those people who lived through it, really. And it's been really interesting to talk about it and to think about it and to explore a little bit of what these men went through, really, which was something that, as I say, is so distant for us now. It's incredible that they went through it, they survived it, and they were able to bring a lot of these experiences into what they would later create, really.
And just worth, you know, remembering when, you know, you see James Doohan on script, you know, I mean, the Star Trek is, as much as it's lofty and idealistic and it's this utopian vision of the future, it is also a military story. You know, they are in a command structure, they are in a, you know, a version of the Navy in space, essentially. And it's kind of interesting to think that many of the people who worked on it, you know, had that background, and had that military background. They knew what it was like to go through the kind of boot camp, to go through the training. They knew what it was like to follow orders. They knew what it was like, you know, in James Doohan's case, to kill someone, and to almost be killed yourself, you know, and in Gene Roddenberry's case, to fly dangerous missions where your plane or your spaceship is on the point of breaking apart because it's being so, you know, tossed around by the forces of nature around it that it's encountering. It gives you a different perspective in some ways on these things if you recognise that as much as these are fantastical stories, as much as these are fictions, you know, for some of these men, they tied in quite closely to real lived experience, to things that they'd gone through themselves, and that must have fed into it one way or another.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, it's been fun talking about the Second World War and the men of the Star Trek universe who served in that conflict in our own universe. But that isn't the only thing we've been talking about this week on Trek FM. So here's a look at some of the other things you might have missed on the network.
Previously on Trek.fm, The Ready Room.
I bet the transporters were invented by Amazon as a way of delivering products to people.
I was totally going to say, it's like Amazon groceries would be like, yeah, I don't have to be there, but it can come like beam to my port. It's like, order, there it arrived, right there. You know,
that's right. Like, you've got a little Amazon dot next to the toilet, you just tap it, and then toilet paper materializes right there.
Standard Orbit.
Every fan takes what they want, what works for them, what complements a story, a series, a show, a movie, and that can be in their heart, in their mind, canon, as in like, well, you know, I love it. It makes me feel good about those characters, the story, so I believe it. Or if you don't, for one reason or another, do you say, well, for me, I'm just going to pretend that didn't happen, or it doesn't connect to the part of the universe that I like.
To the journey!
Wait, you're saying it's like matter and antimatter when they interact?
Yeah, it's like costume or non-costume.
So costumes and non-costumes annihilate each other.
Yes.
In Voyager.
That is how the universe is going to ultimately be destroyed, due to the interaction of naked people and people wearing clothes.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
So check out all of these shows and join in the conversation about your favourite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they are published. And please do leave us a star rating and a written review at the same time. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, and in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link. If you'd also like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/trekfm, that's patreon.com/trekfm, to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, the Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, so we really appreciate any support you can give us, and we hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/trekfm. Duncan and I would love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to get involved and do just that. The best place to join in the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. You can find Duncan and I on the Babel Conference as well, and you can find us both on Twitter, Duncan at Barrett's Books and myself, Tony, at Black Hole Media. And you can also find me hosting my own podcast, the Xcast and X-Files podcast, if you type that into Twitter and Facebook. So thanks everyone for listening to this episode of Primitive Culture. We'll be back soon to discuss more history, culture, and how Star Trek relates to it.
You blend it all.